Friends, would you please join with me in the spirit of prayer? Come, Holy Spirit, come. Stir in our midst, surge within us, that we would be rooted, grounded in your presence in this time and in every time throughout the week to come. Let these words that Paul wrote to the church long ago be breathed with new life for our hearing and for our living out in this community of faith in these days. We ask and offer all of this in the name of the one we seek to follow, Jesus the Christ. Amen. My wife Gina was gone at the time when I decided to live out my God-given right and responsibility as an Iowan and take up gardening. We were living in New Hampshire at the time, and I was inspired after visiting the garden of a parishioner. So I went out and I bought some tomato plants and a shovel. Now it should be an ominous sign to you that I did not already own a shovel. I came home with my treasures, I unloaded them, I went up to get changed. I was a bit disappointed to find out that I didn't own a pair of overalls, or a straw hat, or even a corncob pipe. You would have thought I just naturally would have picked those things up. But I wasn't going to be detoured. My great-grandparents were farmers. My grandparents were farmers. My parents, growing up in Iowa, had a huge garden in the backyard. I mean, how hard could this be? That question, by the way, another ominous sign. Did you know that the state of New Hampshire is nicknamed the Granite State for a very good reason? With each thrust of my shovel into the earth, I hit rock after rock after rock. By the time Gina got home, every muscle in my body just ached, and I was covered head to toe in dirt. There was this pile, a rather large pile of rocks right next to the tomato plants that still hadn't made it into the ground yet. I'm sure it's one of many moments that Gina wondered why in the world she married me. Paul today draws on this image of gardening. He says that he planted and Apollos watered. Last week, when we heard about the divisions in the church, in this church in Corinth, we heard a little bit about Apollos. Apollos, we believe, was a missionary, a Christian missionary from Egypt. We think even more that he grew up within the Jewish faith, and he was from Alexandria. But at some point, he came in contact with one of the Christian missionaries. Maybe he came in contact with Priscilla and Aquila, who were this married couple, who were partners, ministry partners, we think, with Paul, and might have also been fellow tent makers. Maybe it was Priscilla and Aquila who passed along the faith to Apollos. Pause with me here, because that may not seem all that interesting or significant, but I want you to hold that in some tension. The Apostle Paul has, maybe rightfully so, often been seen as chauvinistic. But if you read the letter to the Corinthians, if you read it from beginning to end, as I suggested last week, what you're going to encounter in those verses is Paul numerous times lifting up the ministry of Priscilla. She is one of the early Christian teachers and leaders of the faith. He says to the Corinthians that if they need a model of what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to live, look to Priscilla, look to Apollos, look to these folks as people who live the faith. Paul planted, Apollos watered, but Paul doesn't refer to himself or Apollos as farmers. He says that they are servants of God. Now that's one way to translate Paul's letter. Maybe a more faithful translation of the Greek. The Greek word there is dikos. A better translation might be deacon. Now I know years ago our church had deacons. Some of you out there I know were deacons. And you have this really long list of duties from what I understand. You are responsible for all sorts of things, for setting up coffee hour and special meals like our Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner. I know you delivered plants after Christmas and after Easter. You had to set up communion every month and serve communion every single month. And that's only like the first half of the list, if not more. But a deacon, as Paul's using that word, a deacon, wasn't just a series of things to do. A deacon, as Paul understood it, and as he commended people, was somebody who sensed, who was open to the stirring, surging Spirit of God both within and around us. Open to that Spirit's movement. When I put it in that kind of framework, I think we could talk about the priesthood of all believers. As it says on the back of your bulletin, that the ministers of this church are all of you, not just me. Everyone is a minister in our church. But I think we could also claim, maybe reclaim, that image of a deacon. Isn't the prayerful practice, the hope within each one of us that we would be deacons? We would be open to the stirring, surging Spirit within and around us. And not only for our own end, not only just for ourselves, that we would be open to that Spirit, that we might share it with one another, and that we would share it with this community and with the world God so loves. Because to be open to the Spirit isn't just an end for me, myself, and I. To be open to the Spirit is to share that with others. Just as one plant doesn't make a garden, one person doesn't make a church. To be a church is to be in community with each other. It's to foster these connections with one another. But living in community isn't always easy. It gets messy and complicated with one another. We have these moments of tension, right? When we argue, when we don't see eye to eye, when we disagree with one another. Maybe we want to argue about who left the light on in fellowship hall. We've told you a dozen times to turn it off. Or maybe we start arguing about the fact that, the pastor's been here for a year and a half and hasn't performed a single miracle yet. Just look at what Jesus did in that time. So we have this tension. Living with other people can arise disagreements. Two of my most favorite quotes about living in community. One comes from Henry Nouwen. And he says that home is the place where when you go, they have to accept you. We want this to be a church home, and we don't have to accept you. We want to accept you. We want to accept everyone with the rich diversity that each person has. And we want this to be a place where you can put down roots, call home, be nurtured and nourished for your own good and for the good of the world. That's a great vision, but hold that in some contrast with one of my other favorite quotes about community. This comes from Christine Pohl, who writes a whole book about it. And she says, is insightfully so, she says that in our world today, in our culture, with our reliance on personal freedom, with our reliance on individualism, that's left us isolated. It's left us emotionally fragile and vulnerable. We haven't practiced as people how it is to work through conflicts and disagreements. We don't always practice it in our families. We don't always practice it in the communities where we grow up. And so when we become adults, and we have these tensions, we have these disagreements, we have these arguments, we don't know what to do with them. And because we want this to be home, and we want home to be a place of peace, but what happens when we're in tension with each other, that's messy. That's difficult. And because it's somewhat easy to pull ourselves up and transplant ourselves, how do we do that? Maybe the deeper question when we think about Paul's image of a garden is to ask ourselves, what kind of garden are we here at First Congregational United Church of Christ? Are we an English garden? I always loved English gardens. You know, those trimmed hedges, all perfectly squared off. Such attention to detail. They're meticulously maintained. They're proper and they're dignified. That awakens a sense of awe when I've been in an English garden. Or sometimes I've wandered around a Japanese or Oriental garden. Did you know that in those kind of gardens, their emphasis on rock, that rock isn't just supposed to represent something sturdy or strong. It actually represents water. And out of that springs forth these bonsai trees. And maintaining the bonsai tree, attention to detail. And each trim is done thoughtfully and intentionally. Are we a kind of church that wants to pay attention to detail? Or maybe we're a fruit garden, a vegetable garden, that where we're known by the Spirit, by the fruits of our spirits, by the fruits of our work with each other. Maybe you're thinking about other kinds of gardens as well. I remember the garden my parents would plant every year growing up in Cedar Rapids. There was always a row of corn. It was Iowa, of course. There was always a row of green beans, a row of tomatoes, and then the super vegetable that I like to call zucchini. Did you know that in Iowa, during the summertime, you lock your doors to your car and to your house too. You lock your doors not because you're afraid that somebody's going to break in, but you lock it because if you don't, when you come back, there's going to be a bag of zucchini sitting in the back seat. Honest to God truth. So what kind of garden are we? And maybe the next question is, what happens when we disagree? What happens when you think we're one kind of garden and you think we're another kind of garden? How do we plant ourselves side by side? Because one of the truths about our garden, when you step back and look at First Congregational United Church of Christ, is that what's blossoming here, what's growing here is a rich diversity. We have diversity in age. We have diversity in race. We have diversity in sexual orientation and gender identity. We have diversity in political understanding. And if all of that wasn't enough, just to make it a little bit more fun, we also have diversity in the ways that we understand and live out the faith. In the ways that we as unique plants sense that surging Spirit of God moving in our lives. And so how do we grow side by side? How do we sink our roots deep into the rich soil and let our roots get intermingled with one another? Paul says this morning that he planted and Apollos watered, but who gave the growth? I didn't mean that rhetorically, by the way. I really wanted you to answer. Congregation participation. Who gave the growth? God. A little bit louder? God gave the growth. It doesn't just depend on you or on me or on us together. God is the one who gives the growth. That's all well and good to say in a sermon, but the implications for that will challenge us. Because growth takes time. Eventually, I got those tomato plants into the soil there in New Hampshire. And it took weeks for those tomato plants to start to grow and blossom. I can remember I'd come home and you'd start to see the smallest bud, the flowering bud, and I'd get all excited only to see it wither and die. And that happened a couple of times until one day the teeniest, tiniest green circle appeared in one of those blossoms. And it grew until it ripened and red and became this ruby red shade. And it was the most delicious tomato I ever had. And that was a good thing because we only got like 5 tomatoes off of that plant. Growth takes time. And that's true not only in the gardens we plant, but in the garden of our church. Growth takes time. And we need to have a willingness to wait patiently, to listen for where that stirring, surging Spirit of God is guiding us to go as people, to listen to each other to try to connect with one another. It takes time. Growing as a community takes time as well. I was thinking this week we're going to replace the sign out front, and I was just kind of pondering and came up with the fact that maybe we shouldn't put First Congregational on the sign. Maybe instead the kind of sign we should get out front would just be a banner that would say, "Pardon our dust. We're trying to create a community here." That takes effort and energy, and it takes a reliance on God's presence here. An openness. An openness to one another. An openness to that stirring spirit within each of us and outside of us. And it takes a willingness to wait. To prayerfully wait side by side, trusting that God is not done with us. We are sinking our roots deep. They are becoming intertangled and twined with one another. And there are beautiful things that are happening here and now for our sake and for the sake of the world God so loves. It isn't easy. There are going to be moments when there are problems. Paul saw that. There wasn't some magic bean that Paul planted in Corinth to make everything better. There were problems in Corinth and there are problems today. But there's also possibility. There are rocks in the soil, just like I encountered. There are rocks in the soil when we try to connect with each other. But there's also the rich soil of God's love and grace here in this place. It will take time. It will take energy. We need to wait with each other and rely on God's presence to guide us. But even though it won't be easy, when I think about the church we have, this beautiful community of faith, I know that tending the garden here will be much easier than it ever was gardening in New Hampshire. And for that, I say thanks be to God.